Hello, class, and welcome to the second half of Chapter 5, Karen Horney's Needs and Neurotic Trends. So today we're going to be taking off where we last left off in terms of finishing off the second half of the chapter and talking about Karen Horney's theory. So bear with me as I just set ourselves up. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. As mentioned last time, so this is the slide that we took off from the last time that from the first half of this chapter. So we were talking about neurotic needs and trends. We spoke a bit about basic anxiety. We spoke about the neurotic needs. We spoke about the neurotic trends, and we looked last time at the slide talking about conflict. So what conflict was, according to Karen Horney, was the incompatibility of the neurotic trends, and that this was at the core of neurosis. And again, I emphasize the importance of understanding this. So a neurotic person has one dominant trend, and they battle to keep the non-dominant trends from being expressed. So the difference between a normal or healthy person and a neurotic person, according to Karen Horney, is that, again, keep in mind that both healthy and neurotic individuals experience conflict amongst the trends. The difference being between them is that healthy and neurotic people is that the intensity of the conflict. So those who are neurotic experience the intensity of the conflict between neurotic trends in a lot more of a severe way than the normal person. Another major difference that is important to understand is that the normal person, while they experience this conflict, what usually occurs is that the neurotic trend that then becomes expressed or that becomes dominant is based on the situation at hand and what it calls for. Whereas with the neurotic person, have this singular, precise focus on one specific neurotic trend and everything about what they do. So no matter where they are, what situation, their personality and their behavior becomes solely focused on that neurotic trend. Okay? So let's move along in today's lecture. So the idealized self-image. The idealized self-image is an idealized picture of oneself. What's important to keep in mind here is that, so idealized picture of oneself and unifies personality. The self-image, so what a distinction I want to make here is between what regular and what regular neurotic people have. So the self-image of a normal person is built on a flexible, realistic assessment of one's abilities. And then there's a neurotic self-image, which is based on an inflexible and unrealistic self-appraisal, and is also an unsatisfactory substitute for self-worth. So there's a few things that I want to kind of explain or highlight here that I think is important for understanding. Both normal and neurotic people have a self-image that is or isn't based on reality. So for the normal person, it is based on reality, and for the neurotic person, it's either loosely or not accurately based at all on that person's reality. It's a framework used to approach others and ourselves. So that self-image, like I said, if it's a framework used to not only approach others, but also understanding ourselves, a good way to look at it as a whole, that self-image is a system of understanding. The idealized self so the difference that I wanted to make that's important is that a regular or just a self-image is what a normal, here say my air quotations, a normal person would have, whereas the idealized self-image is more towards what a neurotic person would have. Or another way of looking at it is that a normal person would have a realistic self-image and a neurotic person would have an idealized self-image. Okay? We're going to move along. So with that, in the idealized self-image, two important concepts within Karen Horney's theory. So you have the tyranny of the shoulds. An attempt to realize an unattainable, idealized self-image involves denial of the true self and behaving in terms of what one thinks they should be doing. So again, when you see with the tyranny of the shoulds, involves denial of the true self and behaving in terms of what one thinks they should be doing. So that alludes to the fact that it's not based fully or at all on accurate reality, but more this idealizing, created version of ourselves of who we should be. And so the tyranny of the shoulds then becomes a way of explaining that is that the tyranny, the process, the difficulty that is placed on the neurotic individual in having to, in terms of the pressure they put on themselves to having to attain these levels, right? The things that they should be doing, but the reason why it's a tyranny of the shoulds, or why it torments them, is because the things that they should be doing are not related to the things that they're actually capable of doing. And so again, that's where you see this break from the idealized self-image and actual reality of an individual. It also speaks about externalization. So externalization, a way of defending against conflict caused by the discrepancy between an idealized and a real self-image. Projects conflict onto the outside world. So I'm going to add a couple bit more points and information towards the slide. Neurotic people can never successfully attain their idealized self-image. Again, neurotic people can never successfully attain their idealized self-image because it's not realistic. The result of that unattainability, but constantly striving to attain it, so the result of that failure, so to speak, is it leads to self-hatred. Now, an idealized self-image is believed to be it's believed to be real or accurate by the neurotic person. So they're not aware of this break between their idealized self-image and the reality of their situation. It's a model of what they believe they should be and can be and or is. Self-image for normal people is a goal. For neurotic people, it's a fixed idea demanding rigid adherence. Again, so self-image for normal people is a goal. And I think that goal is based on the reality of the situation. I know I'm sounding a bit repetitive. Whereas for neurotic people, it's this fixed, rigid adherence or even obsession, if you will, with an idea that needs strict obedience, so that no matter where you are, what the situation is, there is no moving, there's no wavering. That is your sole focus. That is your sole goal. Okay. Neurotic people are insecure. The idealized self-image does not make up for reality-based self-worth. Again, so neurotic people are usually insecure because their idealized self-image doesn't make up for reality-based self-worth, which is usually low. So an example of externalization, projecting your own self-hatred, so your hatred towards yourself, onto the outside world, believing that it is the source of hate. It is the source of hate neurotic person feels towards themselves and not from within. So their way of dealing with their self-hatred is to project that hatred on, and we saw projection in the last chapter that we covered with, focusing on Freud. So similar to that, you take one's own feelings and you project them on to the external world. For Karen Horney, it's the hatred that one develops for themselves when they have an idealized self-image. They then project that onto the world, viewing it and believing that it is the world that hates them, when in fact it's their own self-hatred that they're experiencing. Okay, let's move along a little bit here. So, an important aspect of Horney's theory is feminine psychology. It was considered to be feminine psychology, the theory as a whole. So, broken down, what that involved was a revision of psychoanalysis. So, it encompasses psychological conflicts inherent in womanhood and women's roles. As we saw in last chapter, Freud's theory, inherent in Freud's theory, is a lot of um, outdated, traditional, sexist views of both of women and of men. And so, in response to that, as we mentioned before, Karen Horney started off under the school of Freud and then deviated from that in large part because of the lack of focus and explanation of women's personality development and this view of woman as being lesser than, largely explained by the whole penis envy theory. So this was in response to that, and as it says, it encompasses psychological conflicts inherent in womanhood and woman's role, speaking about the woman experience. In response to penis envy directly, Karen Horney developed womb envy. So for Karen Horney, womb envy was male envy toward women due to her capacity for motherhood. As it says, Horney's counter concept of Freud's penis envy. What Horney believed was that, so men experienced womb envy in their life. The way in which they resolved that conflict, if you will, or found a way to kind of deal or manage with that conflict, that womb envy, was focusing their efforts towards professional academic success. Okay, so just a few points to add to that. Womb envy was based on pleasure Horney experienced during childbirth. Men, according to Horney, men sublimate womb envy, overcompensating by seeking success in their work, as I just explained. Resentment created by womb envy is manifested unconsciously. So men do not consciously, actively experience this womb envy. They're not aware of it. The way that it's manifested unconsciously is by either belittling women, establishing dominance over women, or sexism as a whole. And Horney believed that women's perceived inferiority towards men was not due to this innate, inherent penis envy that all women experienced. Horney actually believed it was largely because of gender roles. So she believed that this inferiority that women experienced was not something that they were born with, but rather something that they learned through society, with the way that society viewed women relative to men, gender roles for both sexes, the expectations, rampant sexism that was prevalent throughout, whether it was academia, the theories that we've covered as well. So that was Horney's way of explaining it, and you could see the stark contrast between her explanations and her focus on womanhood versus Freud's psychology and how it would focus more on men and had a very negative view or reductionist view of women as a whole. Okay, move along. So we're going to stay with feminine psychology. So flight from womanhood. This flight from womanhood led to feelings of inferiority that lead women to deny their femininity. It causes sexual inhibitions. And Horney also had her own version and explanation of the Oedipus complex. So we did cover this in Freud's theory the last time that we were in class. So Horney took the Oedipus complex, but she removed the sexual component of it. So she reinterpreted the situation as a neurotic conflict between dependence and hostility towards parents. And the sexual element that was removed was this desire that Freud believed that children innately had towards the parent of the opposite sex. So for Horney, certain parental behaviors create hostility from the child if they undermine the need for safety and security. Combined with our dependence on our parents at an early age, this explained the conflict between feelings of dependence and hostility. So again, if you attach what I just read to the Oedipus complex according to Horney, like I think everybody agrees on, like what's just stated in Freud's theory, children as infants in our early years are completely dependent upon our parents. So in that sense, there's this dependence. Horney didn't take it so far as this dependence then manifests itself into this this sexual drive or yearning for the parent of the opposite sex. She described it naturally as having a dependence between us, or a certain level of affection, versus the hostility that we experience towards our parents, inevitably, because at some times, parents are going to do things that are going to threaten our sense of security. So, and a simple way of doing that can be through punishment. So you see that the way Horney explained it, she takes a more her approach to explaining this balance or this conflict between the dependence that we feel or that we have towards our parents and the hostility that we have towards them, in a more readily explainable or understandable way, right? She's not just saying it's these sex drives and forces that we have no control over, but she naturally explains it with what children usually experience during childhood: natural dependence on parents versus hostility we feel when some of our actions are met with punishment or lack of praise. Continuing along with that, so conflict between dependence and hostility only happens when parents undermine their child's security. So it's not biologically based. It's not universal to all. And that's a major difference between Horney's theory and from Freud. Again, I'm going to repeat that. Conflict between dependence and hostility only happens when parents undermine their child's security. Okay? So that conflict is not seen as something that is inevitable or naturally occurring based on how humans are born and what we're predisposed to. For Horney, this conflict only came when a child's sense of security was undermined. Okay, let's move along. So I'm going to continue along with feminine psychology. So motherhood or career. Horney argued that women must seek their identity by developing their abilities and pursuing careers. The problem is that, as mentioned before, with how things were back in the day, doing this contradicts traditional roles and creates conflicts in women. Horney also recognized the impact of social and cultural forces on personality, as you've seen right here. So, to add to that, qualities considered to be useful or necessary to be successful in one's career often go against or conflict with the traditional view that people had of women. And as you'll see in the slides, if you're accessing them, at the bottom in the added notes, there's a video that I included, a link to a YouTube video that you could go and that you can look at. The videos aren't necessary, but I do feel that it's a good way to kind of add extra support in terms of understanding the material that we're covering. So this slide, I do encourage you to watch it. The videos are usually about 4 or 5 minutes long. I do think it's worth it. You stand to gain a lot more than you do to lose. Okay. So questions about human nature. So along with Horney's theory, there was a focus and an emphasis, a belief in the free will of individuals. It highlighted the influence of nurture. So when you hear about the nurture versus nature debate, for those of you who are not aware of that or don't fully understand it, nature covers the things that we're born to, predispositions. So a lot of that was covered by Freud's theory in terms of biological forces, right? Speaking about instincts and the drives, versus nurture. So nurture, when somebody nurtures a child, it's the influence of the environment that we're in and the experiences that we have as we're growing up. So another way of capturing that is what we learn. Nature covers what we're predisposed to, the way that we're born. Nurture is about how we develop through our environment and learning. So for Horney's theory, there was an emphasis and it highlighted the influence of nurture in human and personality development. It focused on the past and the present, whereas Freud's often focused on the past, specifically from birth to about age 5 or 6, as we saw, where at that point, Oftentimes, the superego had already been developed, and Freud felt that most of the child's foundational personality had already been established. There was an emphasis on our uniqueness, a belief in growth and flexibility of the individuals. We're not just slaves, if you will, to our early childhood experiences or biological forces. And the view is seen as being more optimistic, whereas Freud focused a lot on a constant state of conflict, constantly dealing with anxiety, the neurotic individual, aggressive tendencies, and so on. This was a lot more optimistic or positive view of individuals and humanity. So, to add to that, with this theory from Horney, we see that people are not controlled by biological forces. Neuroses can be avoided if children are raised with love, acceptance, and trust. So there is an attainable, realistic way for people to avoid suffering or neuroses. Whereas with Freud, he believed that we were predisposed towards neurosis, and he really focused his theory about how people deal with that neurosis. Along with this theory, everyone has an innate ability to self-realization. Again, speaking towards the optimism and positivity of the theory. And people can consciously shape or change personality through experiences we have throughout our lives, not just the past that's important. We can resolve our own problems. And one way that Horney showed this was through self-analysis. So at the beginning of the lecture, part 1, we spoke about Horney's move away from free association and moving toward self-analysis. Okay. We're almost there, guys. Just bear with me. So if you look at assessment in Horney's theory, so she modified some of Freud's techniques. So you see here right away, you do see that free association and dream analysis, two forms of assessment that we saw in Freud's theory are also used by Horney. So in free association, focus is on visible emotional reactions of the patient towards the therapist. So I want to touch on that a little bit. If you remember from the last chapter, when Freud was engaging in free association, he felt it was important that, so we had this image of a client lying down on a couch kind of looking up. And Freud was always positioned behind the patient, so that way his presence wouldn't influence or interfere with the free association. And his relationship with his patient was always one that was kind of distant or a little bit cold. Horney was very much different. So what she focused on was engaging in free association, but in that point, the therapist was always in front of the client or the patient. She did not want to establish in any way, shape, or form some form or type of power dynamic between the therapist and between her patient. And what she felt was important was, as it mentions here, the visible emotional reaction of the patient towards the therapist. She felt that by focusing on and examining and exploring the relationship that she had with her patient and the dynamic that she had, the way in which the patient would respond and behave in that gave her or insight into how the patient could respond or behave in the outside world or with other people. She felt that was essential and crucial towards understanding the patient, and then as well being able to help them see through their issues or their problems. Sorry, just give me one sec. Plug my computer in so I don't die on you. Okay. For dream analysis. So dream analysis reveals a person's true self and focuses on the emotional content of the dream. So for Freud, if you remember dream analysis, there was a lot about the latent content and the manifest content, looking at what was actually going on in the dream, so the actual experience of the dream, and then what was the hidden message. For Horney, it was more about what was the emotional content and focus of the dream and how that relates to what the client is experiencing in terms of issues, neuroses, problems, difficulties with basic anxiety. If you move down, we see there's the compliant, aggressive, and detached personality types. So this was a 35-item self-report inventory that measures the neurotic trends, which was something that was created that stemmed from Horney's theory, along with the Horney-Coolidge Type Indicator, or HCTI, which is a 57-item self-report inventory that measures the neurotic trends. So just adding to that, Horney believed that the patient and therapist should have a collaborative relationship, whereas Freud's was way too distant. Free association focused on how client behaves towards the therapist, believing it revealed the patient's way of interacting with others in general. Did not focus on unconscious mind like Freud did. Dreams represent attempts to solve problems, constructively or neurotically, and that dream analysis focuses on emotional content of a dream to interpret the meaning of it. Okay, let's move along. So, research on Horney's theory. Horney used the case study method to conduct her research. The focus of her research was on neurotic trends, feminine psychology, and the tyranny of the should, and neurotic competitiveness. So the need to win at all costs. There's two types of competitiveness: competing to win, CW, and competing to excel. So this is where, so when research was done exploring the effectiveness, the usefulness, the validity of Horney's theory, that research tended to focus on neurotic trends, feminine psychology, and the tyranny of the shoulds, and then also about neurotic competitiveness. Research on Horney's theory in terms of the results: aggressive neurotic trends. So people who score high on aggressive neurotic trends may not perform well in school, may have mental health issues, and are more likely to major in business. With neurotic competitiveness, people who score high on this trait tend to be more neurotic, narcissistic, authoritarian, so a little bit more controlling or directive, and low in self-esteem. So contributions of Horney's theory. Major contributions include: the theory has a common sense appeal and is easily understood. So the common sense appeal, I think, in terms of understanding the importance of a sense of childhood security and safety. And then as well, the common sense appeal of that, how behaviors explain in terms of how people and individuals can deviate from normal forms of behavior or personality if that sense of safety and security is compromised in any way. Continuing along with relevant contributions, it was relevant to current American culture, her theory. Also that neurotic trends are seen as a valuable way to categorize deviant behavior, and has had significant impact on the personality theories of Erik Erikson, which we're going to see in later lectures, as well as Abraham Maslow. And then, finally, criticisms. It was felt that Horney's theory denied the role of biological influences. So while Freud's theory was criticized as being on one extreme of relying too heavily or focusing too much on uncontrollable innate biological influences, people felt that in response to that, Horney's theory went too far to the other side in terms of completely excluding it and not incorporating biological influences in her understanding of the development of personality. Another criticism is that it reduced the emphasis on sexuality and the unconscious, not enough exploration of the unconscious and then how that relates to personality formation. It was felt that it was incomplete and inconsistent as a theory, and that it heavily influenced by the middle class American culture, not able to be generalized to all or the majority of culture or society. So again, I want to thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, you can always send me a message directly on Mio, and I'll be able to answer to you through that, as well as possibly opening up question periods where using Zoom, I can invite students and we can have a question period where all of you can hear each other's questions and responses, and hopefully that kind of helps cement and supplement your understanding. Have a great day, stay healthy and stay safe, people. Take care.